His very attempt at undoing the projections actually reinforced them. It became clear, right, that the patient heard everything through this filter of yet again something that I haven't gotten right, yet again, I'm messing up, I must be so unreasonable, right? There is no evidence for this, and yet I feel this way. What a dummy I am. You want to be really, really careful that you're not asking your patients to do something that they can't do. Okay, what I was just modeling here, that's where that patient was. That's what she could have done. That would have been a beautiful beginning. Gradual exposure to emotional closeness. By staying in the here and now, and with the patient's real-time perceptions and reactions, there is low-level but continuous exposure to emotional closeness that builds capacity and can restructure defenses and clear out distortions. Because that is all that anger is. It's a felt sense of, I don't like this. Okay? So the patient going, oh darn, that was actually her experiencing some negative feeling towards the therapist. Hi everyone, Johannes Keating here. So I had this interesting experience the other day. I met with one of my lovely supervisees, and we were watching some of his work, and it's clear that the patient is having reactions, feelings towards him. In so many words, she even indicates this. There's activation there. It's just fairly obvious, especially given the context. But I noticed that my supervisee, who typically does beautiful work, he wasn't working in the T with her. Right? He wasn't working in the immediacy of her perceptions, reactions, feelings towards him. So I said, how come you're not doing that? And his response was fairly interesting. He was of the idea that when you work in the T, you're inevitably ramping up with heavy pressure and challenge towards this rapid mobilization of the patient's psychodynamics and their unconscious towards an unlocking. And because his patient was more on the fragile end of the spectrum, that would be contraindicated, which he was totally correct about. And so, in other words, what came to light was that he did not know about the many, many, many different and important ways of working in the transference that do not involve rapid mobilizations or do not involve attempts at getting unlockings of the unconscious proper. And so we had the idea that I should probably make a video about that because maybe he wasn't the only one. So here goes. Briefly on my terminology. So when I say rapid mobilization to mobilize the patient's psychodynamics, to mobilize their unconscious, I am using that synonymously with heavy pressure and challenge. So I'll be using these phrases interchangeably. Heavy pressure and challenge, rapid mobilization of the unconscious towards an unlocking. Okay, so that's a terminology piece. Now, the most common contraindications for the standard pressure and challenge, the standard technique of ISTDP, they involve the reinforcement of a transference resistance, particularly a passive transference resistance. So in other words, standard ISTDP, here the therapist is quite active, right? And if the patient has a passive transference resistance, the therapist activity will simply reinforce the patient's passivity. Okay, so that's one common contraindication. Also, if you don't have a conscious therapeutic alliance, that's another contraindication to begin that kind of mobilization work. You might reinforce projective processes. You might step into the shoes of genetic figures from the patient's past. The patient may not have the capacity to tolerate that kind of a work. You might be reenacting problematic dynamics where the patient might feel criticized or steamrolled. You could become one more person in the patient's life where you are pushing your own agenda onto the patient. That might be the story of their lives. That might be the very thing you need to not do. And so the standard approach of ISTDP with rapid mobilization can very much recreate those kind of dynamics. So food for thought, things to be mindful of. Another contraindication would be where, and not just for the standard approach of ISTDP, but for other interventions, and more on that in a minute, but patients where their primary mode of communication, both with sharing and receiving, is more through action language rather than verbal representational speech. You typically see this more in fragile clients, patients who are concrete thinkers, patients with heavy projective processes, where the important differentiations and observational capacities have not yet been fully established, patients that are acting out in one form or another. Here, these kinds of patients will typically be much more tuned into how you are, how you behave with them, how you approach them, how you come across to them, much, much more so than the content of what you say, the content of your speech. Here, these kinds of patients typically filter everything that you say and do through a set of core thematic lenses. Typically, they struggle with differentiation issues, where not only are you reminding them of someone else, they're actually conflating you with other figures. So let me add a little meat to this idea. So the other day, I had one of my lovely supervisees show his work with a patient who relied on regressive defenses. She was weepy, compliant. My supervisee pointed out her compliance. She seemed to freeze and become even more weepy, and she seemed to interpret whatever my supervisee said as criticism. The weepiness intensified as my supervisee discussed her self-defeating pattern of putting herself on the back burner, underscoring the cost of these defenses. At some point, the patient indicated to my supervisee that she was concerned about upsetting him and not getting it right. Wonders of wonders, the UTA, right? Pointing to what the therapist needed to attend to. And my supervisee then asked if there was evidence that would suggest that he was that sort of a person where she would have to feel like she's walking on thin ice. And so this intervention, it might have been perfect. It would probably be perfect with another type of patient. But with this patient, his very attempt at undoing the projections actually reinforced them. It became clear, right, that the patient heard everything through this filter of yet again something that I haven't gotten right, yet again, I'm messing up, I must be so unreasonable, right? There is no evidence for this, and yet I feel this way. What a dummy I am, okay? So in this particular segment of what we watched, whatever the therapist said was getting interpreted through the lens of I'm being criticized, I'm messing up, our relationship is on thin ice. To actually make a dent and undo this sort of a thing, the therapist would need to encourage the patient to elaborate on her concerns, to reinforce this openness, and celebrate that the patient could give a voice to the part of her that felt this way. This would undo projections not by asking for evidence, which can actually sound very lawyerly and sort of prosecutorial, but by being different from the projections and drawing the patient out, so that she can begin to reflect on her own perceptions and come to a better reality testing through encouragement rather than questioning. So with these sorts of patients, that's the way to go there. So this is a way of working in the T, hanging out in the T, if you will, but again, not with rapid mobilization, not towards an unlocking proper. So what are some common reasons to hang out in the T? And by the way, important caveat, sometimes we need to get the hell out of the T. My supervisor, who's now retired, he once said that to me. I was working with a high-functioning borderline client, and I wasn't doing a great job, and he said, get out of the T, to regulate her anxiety. So, but having said that, actually, if you do it skillfully, you can be in the T, and that can have beautiful regulating effects on anxiety. More on that in a minute. So sorting out projections would be an obvious reason to hang out in the T, but without heavy pressure and challenge. Clearing out distortions, cleaning up the transference, making sure you're not in the shoes of others, right? Facilitating these important distinctions. Facilitating a corrective emotional experience. The T is a wonderful place to help the patient tolerate complexity at a pace that they can handle. It's a beautiful place to help the patient see that what did not go well in other relationships can actually go well in this one. Circling back to the corrective emotional experience. Going for a rapid mobilization with heavy pressure and challenge, going for that unlocking can blow the opportunity for the corrective emotional experience out of the water. You can effectively miss that opportunity in sort of an eagerness to get an unlocking of the unconscious. And anecdotally, the corrective emotional experience sometimes seems to actually be more therapeutic than the unlocking of the unconscious. For sure, there's a lot of anecdotal data that points to the idea that when unlockings of the unconscious occur outside a context of a really strong, trusting therapeutic relationship, tends to not be all that therapeutic in the end, actually. Helping the patient work through feelings towards you at a level of intensity that they can handle. That is important, and that's another way of working in the transference, but without heavy pressure and challenge. So a much more graded approach. Another instance when you probably want to hang out in the tea, but without heavy pressure and challenge, is if you don't have a conscious therapeutic alliance. Hanging out in the tea can be a way of not only bringing this to the patient's attention, but maybe even getting one. So, for example, a therapist might say, do you see how we aren't able to get off the ground here, and how what could be a strong therapeutic relationship between us unravels as you don't commit yourself to really looking at yourself and your own priorities in here, for example. Again, this is hanging out in the tea, but without heavy pressure and challenge. Gradual exposure to emotional closeness. I really, really value this one. Gradual exposure to emotional closeness. By staying in the here and now, and with the patient's real-time perceptions and reactions, there is low-level but continuous exposure to emotional closeness that builds capacity and can restructure defenses and clear out distortions. As an anxiety-regulating intervention, by staying focused in the here and now, very much interested in the patient's experience, their perceptions of you, okay, and being direct about it, you are essentially conveying to the patient that they're in good hands, that you can tolerate a direct relationship with them. You're open to criticism. How are you experiencing and seeing me right now? Right? It conveys that you can tolerate that kind of directness, that you're open to criticism, and that can lower anxiety for a certain class of patients. Meeting the patient where they are and not asking them to do something that they cannot do. So another little vignette here. I think of a supervisee I saw a while back who showed me a case where the patient's eyes were just really glazed over and they looked lost. It was just clear that they were not tracking. They were not getting it. And the therapist kept trying to explain the triangle of conflict over and over, but it just wasn't gaining any traction. It was not sticking one bit. The patient looked lost. There was no striated signaling, obviously. At one point, the therapist, I think they were trying to undo the omnipotent transference resistance. They said, well, I can't rescue you. You're going to have to do this work. Whereupon the patient, sort of in tongue-in-cheek, responded, oh, darn, or oh, gosh, darn it, or something to that effect, which was actually the beachhead. That was the opening. Unfortunately, at that moment in time, my supervisee didn't catch it. If the therapist had ceased on that moment, it would have been an opportunity to really help the patient see the triangle of conflict experientially by meeting the patient where she was. It would have also been a great opportunity to help redefine anger for the patient, because the therapist kept asking, so what feelings are coming up underneath this? What feelings are coming up? And the patient was lost. But if the therapist had helped the patient see that her dislike of the therapist not being able to rescue her, that actually is the beginning of having a feeling towards the therapist, because that is all that anger is. It's a felt sense of, I don't like this, okay? So the patient going, oh darn, that was actually her experiencing some negative feeling towards the therapist. And so that would have been the beachhead. That would have been the entry point to go, that felt sense of, oh, you really don't like it. That's what I mean. I call that anger. So that would also then begin to detoxify whatever negative associations that the patient might have about anger, right? A lot of people think that anger means hollering or explosive discharge, temper tantrums. With these kinds of patients, it's often very helpful to simplify things into a simple binary of you like something or you don't like something, and just helping them to connect to a felt sense of I like this or I don't like this. Most patients will be able to connect to, oh, I don't like that. Okay, that's the beginning. For people with a certain capacity, that's it. That's where you want to be. You just want to help them connect to I like this, I don't like this. That's the beginning of the complex transference feelings towards you, okay, at a lower level. And so you want to be really, really careful that you're not asking your patients to do something that they can't do. Okay, what I was just modeling here, that's where that patient was. That's what she could have done. That would have been a beautiful beginning. But simply just asking for feelings, that was not going to work with this kind of a patient. Just to make sure I'm really painting a full picture, I had a patient a while back who had to comply and put herself on the back burner with her parents growing up. And it had been her whole life. It was the story of her life to mold herself and pattern herself according to the expectations of others. And so understandably, the patient had a real hot button around when other people wanted something from her, okay, because that had been the story of her life, and she had had to give up her autonomy and all of that. And so understandably, when she could either sense that I really did want something from her, I wanted her to be different, I wanted her to get better, even though they were good things that I wanted from her, it didn't matter. It was just, here's one more person in my life who wants something from me. That hit that raw place in her, okay? Or she imagined that I wanted something that maybe I didn't want. But either way, it was close enough to the reality that, of course, I wanted her to get better, that we could really work around this, okay? And so the reason I'm sharing this vignette is that this is a patient where I would be in the T almost exclusively, but without heavy pressure and challenge. Instead, just a very honest interest in all of her perceptions of me, right? Acknowledging that I could understand that why she would feel this anger and disgust towards me, right? When she either correctly sensed that I wanted something or imagined that I did. And then just gently helping her acknowledge the disgust, but then also the other side of the equation, which involved positive feelings towards me, just to know, oh, wow, so there's your positive feeling. Yeah, if that part of you had a voice, what would it feel like saying? Oh, and now there's that disgust again. I don't blame you. And what if that part of you had a voice? What would it feel like saying to me? Whoops, now it looks like you might be demonizing me. What do you think? Wow, it seems really important for you right now to find reasons to disqualify me and write me off. And yet at the same time, it seems like we have a very strong collaboration at the end of the day. That's pretty hard to deny, isn't it? That sort of a thing. Just in a very gentle, back and forth kind of a way in the T, right? Focused on feeling and affect, but at a low level, pointing out defenses in a way that's casual and just like, oh, do you see this? And okay, hanging out in the T, as I'm calling it in this video, but without heavy pressure and challenge. There is so much to be gained from doing that, and so please don't think that the only way to work in the T is with heavy pressure and challenge. Okay, enough of me prattling about. That will be all today. Till next time, take care.